Welcome to this presentation on luck and nuclear weapons. I'm Benoît Pelopidas, the founding director of Nuclear Knowledges, the first scholarly research program on nuclear politics which refuses funding carrying conflicts of interest. In this short presentation, we will explore the meaning of luck, the method to research it, evidence of past lucky cases of avoidance of unwanted nuclear explosions, why current nuclear weapons policy still relies on luck, how to research and teach it. In the following video, we will hear two eminent scholars and professors of international relations from different traditions, William Walker and Champa Biswas, explain why the notion of luck is useful in their perspectives. In August 2022, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has started the NPT Review Conference by saying, "We have been extraordinarily lucky so far, but luck is not a strategy." End quote. The ambassador from Costa Rica also referred to the role of luck in the avoidance of unwanted nuclear explosions over the last 70 more years, mentioning the words of former US Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The words of the UN Secretary General and Mr. McNamara are neither weird nor rare. A long list of policy and military officials have claimed that we have relied on factors beyond human control to avoid nuclear explosions in specific episodes since the 1960s at least. So let's start with the long and probably incomplete list of officials from the US, the Soviet Union, the UK, and international organizations who have invoked the role of factors beyond human control as necessary to avoid unwanted nuclear explosions so far. They call them luck, chance, or divine providence. Beyond Mr. McNamara, the list includes Dean Acheson, President Kennedy's special envoy dispatched to France at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Nikolai Leonov, head of Cuban affairs in the KGB at the same time, Gerald C. Smith, chief U.S. delegate to the Strategic Arms Limitation Talk. Most recently, since the end of the Cold War, one should add former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz, former U.S. National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Chairman of the Senate Armed Forces Committee Sam Nunn, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, and former head of Strategic Air Command and Strategic Command General Lee Butler, whose picture you see behind me, as well as, beyond the US, former UK Secretary of State for Defense Lord Des Brown of Leaderton, and former IAEA Director General Hans Blix. This was boring, this was a list, and this was also my first argument. The key point and my main argument is that we now know that they were correct. To decide the matter, it was important to first become able to distinguish cases in which the avoidance of unwanted nuclear explosions could be attributed to control from the ones in which it could not. Otherwise, we would misattribute all cases of absence of unwanted nuclear explosion to a success of control. To avoid that trap, I identified 3 cases in which luck was necessary. When what prevented the explosion happened independently from control practices, thanks to the failure of at least one of the control practices, or despite the failure of at least one of the control practices. None of those types of cases can be labeled as control. They have to be called luck. It is then crucial to distinguish between controlled cases of near-nuclear use and lucky ones, between controlled and lucky close calls. These distinctions also indicate the kind of evidence one should look at and look for, either in written primary sources or interviews, in order to distinguish controlled close calls from lucky ones. Now, let's look at each type of case. On the night of September 15, 1980, engine number 5 of a B-52 caught fire at Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota in the United States. This will be our first lucky close call, a case in which unwanted nuclear disaster was avoided independently from control practices. Despite the intervention of the fire brigade, the fire lasted for more than 3 hours. On board the bomber were Mark 28 nuclear weapons and SRAM systems, which were later found to be highly fire sensitive. There has been some debate about the likelihood of a nuclear explosion if the flames had reached the compartment in which the weapons were located. Regardless of that controversy, director of the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, Roger Batzel, testified before the US Senate in 1988 that if the fire had simply reached the explosives surrounding the warhead, the effects could have been worse than Chernobyl, let alone the possibility of a nuclear explosion. In that specific case, the three factors that prevented the disaster are strictly independent from control practices. Think about them. The strength of the wind that kept the flame at bay until the fire was extinguished, the fact that it did not change direction for those 3 hours, and the fact that the burning B-52 was parked in the right place on the tarmac for this effect to be possible. Beyond Grand Forks, the Petrov 1983 seems to be a case of avoidance of an unwanted nuclear explosion thanks to the failure of at least one control practice. On September 26 of 1983, the Second Cold War was raging. The Reagan administration was conducting the largest military buildup in the history of the country. In March of that year, the US president had called the Soviet Union the evil empire. Earlier that month, on September 1st, a Soviet interceptor had shot down a civilian airliner from Korean Airlines, which had US citizens on board, including US Congressman from Georgia, Larry McDonald. Needless to say that the situation was tense. This is the story of radar officer Colonel Stanislas Petrov, who was not supposed to be on duty that day. His radar detected 1, 2, 3, 4, and finally 5 dots, which looked like signals of a NATO attack. He was trained to report this to give the leadership decision time to order a strike or not. He chose to wait for 8 minutes and judged that it was not a strike. As we now know, he was right. This episode is sometimes described as a case of controlled close call because Petrov used a well-trained judgment. But this is not a convincing interpretation. Petrov hijacked decision time, and in doing so, he disobeyed. Later on, he was severely punished for that very reason. The Goldsboro episode in the sky of North Carolina in 1961 includes 2 cases. A fortunate outcome in spite of the failure of control practices regarding working technology. A delivery vehicle, a B-52, broke apart after refueling, pulling an armed rod free in the process to initiate the weapons arming sequence. And a fortunate outcome independent from existing control practices of all sorts. Here, I will treat it as an example of the latter type of lucky close call. On that day of January 24, 1961, the refueling of a B-52 bomber went wrong. The plane broke apart, and 2 3.8 megaton bombs went into free fall. That is, 2 bombs of the destructive capacity of 250 Hiroshima each, and only one switch prevented the explosion of one of those. One cannot argue that the control system worked properly, since in the 20 years that followed, records show that the same switch failed more than 20 times. The explosion was thus avoided thanks to the non-coincidence of 2 failures that did occur: the dislocation of the plane in midair and an inadvertent electrical discharge that would have set the bomb to explode on the ground. This non-coincidence is independent from control procedures, and it is fortunate that we live in a world in which at least one thermonuclear explosion did not strike North Carolina 63 years ago. This account of the role of luck in the avoidance of unwanted nuclear explosions is most likely incomplete for several reasons beyond the one that I only chose one example of each case. These cases of limits of control are not known in most nuclear weapon states because they remain classified. We are most likely blind to such cases also in recent decades, since even in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, considered to be one of the most important and best documented cases, it took more than 3 decades for lights to be shed on its real danger and the role of luck in its non-catastrophic outcome. In order not to jeopardize their careers, guardians of nuclear arsenals have an interest in keeping disobedience and technical failures quiet, and we now know that they did. Physicist Sidney Drell, author of an influential report on the subject presented to the US Congress in 1990, identified 32 cases of nuclear weapons-related accidents, so-called broken arrows, in US history up to 1980. He told me in 2013 that he was convinced that multiple other events remain secret. Assuming that my assessment of luck is complete would then be tantamount to assuming that while the US alone had dozens of cases of that kind, the 7 nuclear weapons programs about which we know very little have experienced none. That takes us to the last part of my argument. One might wish to reassure oneself that luck, which has prevented unwanted nuclear explosions so far, will have no role to play in the future, given the progress made in weapons safety. In other words, we would have regained perfect control over nuclear weapons. This confidence seems excessive for the following reasons. First, one cannot but observe that there is pressure in the opposite direction. Deliberate loss of control is being discussed in the name of the credibility of the retaliatory threat. This is manifested in the renewed proposals to automate or delegate to artificial intelligence the command and control of nuclear weapon systems. Moreover, the modernization undertaken to counter possible hacking problems is leading to an increase in the complexity of nuclear weapons command and control systems, creating new possibilities for systemic accidents which are a priori unforeseeable. Second, in order to assert with confidence that we are now in complete control, we would need to be able to verify claims of progress in nuclear weapons safety in all nuclear armed states. However, the institutions in charge of the control of nuclear weapons have, as I said, every incentive to overstate their control, and archival evidence shows that they have regularly done so in the past when they are not entirely opaque. Claiming anything but perfect control would be to admit to a failure of their primary mission. Third, as the institutions in charge of stockpile control do indeed come to believe their own communication campaigns that weapons have become perfectly safe, the confidence in their ability to solve all the problems they encounter can lead to complacency. We have seen this in the careless practices of US Air Force ICBM officers in recent years. Fourth, let us remember that accidental explosions are only one manifestation of the loss of control over a nuclear crisis. Uncontrolled escalation or unauthorized firing can also lead to an unwanted nuclear explosion. From this perspective, desirable safety advances do not exhaust the physical vulnerability to which nuclear weapons expose our world. Finally, high-level military authorities are on the record saying that they rely on fortuitous disobedience somewhere in the chain of command in case of a crazy order to launch. This is an acknowledgement of the role of luck, understood as people will know when to disobey and will do so in those circumstances only. This is the opposite of control, of course, given that the control procedure is that no one should ever disobey. This reliance on luck was visible in the testimony of Stratcom Commander General Robert Kaler before the US Congress in November 2017, as well as in recent commentary on the war in Ukraine by high-level military officers in France and other countries. Behind me, you can see a QR code which gives you access to all the scholarly publications providing the arguments and evidence I've presented earlier. They are all freely available in open access, and I hope they will be of use to you. To wrap up, allow me to remind you of the 3 main takeaways of this presentation. Numerous policymakers and high-level military personnel have invoked the role of luck in the avoidance of past unwanted nuclear explosions for decades, even if they would have benefited from doing the opposite. Scholarship free from conflicts of interest now demonstrates that in key episodes, we have indeed avoided unwanted nuclear explosions thanks to the failure of control practices, thanks to factors which are independent from control practices, or in spite of the failure of control practices. In other words, we now know that we lucked out. And for the reasons I've just outlined, current long-term policy planning still relies on luck. So, contrary to what Secretary General Gutierrez said, not only are we acting as though luck were a strategy, but we choose the strategy. I hope this gave you the tools to research it further and to teach it. Do not hesitate to share it, to watch the discussion with William Walker and Champa Biswas, and to use the other material we have made available to you. Thank you for your attention.